Throughout England's wide dominion, hear the trumpet loudly roar. Babylon is fallen, is fallen, is fallen. Babylon is fallen to rise no more. Babylon is fallen, is fallen, is fallen. Babylon is fallen to rise no more.
So hello and welcome to another one of our Cromwellian conversations. My name's Stuart, I'm the curator of the Cromwell Museum in Huntingdon. So it's been a week or two since the last done a video, simply because I've had a bit of time off, but I'm delighted to be joined this morning by one of our volunteers at the Cromwell Museum, John Davies. And John's joined me this morning to have a bit of a chat about a rather obscure and strange group that sort of existed during sort of the period immediately after the Civil Wars, but a significant one nonetheless, to a group called the Fifth Monarchists. So, and John, I know, has got a particular interest in this and has written an article recently for our volunteers newsletter about it. It would be quite interesting to have a bit of a chat this morning about that and share some of our thoughts with you. Morning, John. You okay?
Morning. Yeah, everything okay? Yes. Brilliant.
Well, yeah, so thank you for joining us from the bubble of lockdown at the moment. Still, hopefully, not too much longer over the next couple of weeks. So, yeah. So, just give us a sort of very start with a very brief overview. If we're talking about these sort of all these strange sects and political groups and organisations that emerge in the aftermath of the Civil War, isn't it? What's different about the Fifth Monarchists? Who are the Fifth Monarchists?
Well, the Fifth Monarchists actually officially emerged in December 1651. But I mean, there's a number of things. One of my takes is that to really understand them, I think you need to go back, because I think there's elements that are important about the influence they may have had. An interesting question that before 1651, out of all the groups, I mean, there's an absolute plethora of these Muggletonians, ranters. Interesting, the last Muggletonian, official member of the Muggletonians, died in about 1970. Quite good.
Either very long lived, or it was a very long-lived.
The Fifth Monarchists managed to disappear a little bit before that. I mean, there's a lot of strange things with these groups. It's all very millenarian, and it's very difficult to be precise about what they mean. I mean, they're in and out of each other's groups. It's very difficult to track all of this. And one of the key things, though, with the Fifth Monarchy is they believe that what's going to happen, they take it from the book of Daniel, that there were four empires, and basically the Greek, the Roman, etc. The Roman was perpetuated by the Pope and is thus the evil Antichrist. And what they see as happening, the English Civil War, obviously leading on in the context of the 30 Years' War and the rest of it, is going to be the victory of the godly over the ungodly, leading to the universal overthrow of the Antichrist, ushering in the reign of, and this is quite interesting bit what they said, they're ushering the reign of Jesus through his saints. And after 1,000 years of the rule by the saints, Jesus will come again for the final judgment. But the catch with these guys is a lot of them believe that you can't just sit there. You've actually got to pick up a stick, a sword, a musket, or certainly a pretty virulent pamphlet and get stuck in to make it happen.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of these sort of organisations and groups and kind of sects, if you like, that emerge at this time, they're very obsessed by, you know, it's almost like the end times are coming, as you say, these sort of millenarian beliefs, which I suppose is quite understandable, bearing in mind, you know, what they've just gone through with a sort of turmoil of civil war, and as you say, the sort of, you know, upheavals on the continent and everything else. It's kind of understandable in a way, really, that people would develop that kind of mindset.
Yeah, I think that the big thing with this, to understand all of these groups, is that we're dealing with essentially a pre-scientific society. So everything, I mean, and the classic is with Cromwell, you know, why does Cromwell think he wins his victory? Because God's on his side. Without God, you don't win. You lose God's approval, and you end up with a Barbados muck up, you know, things don't work. So everything is seen within that context. And certainly the upheaval, obviously, in the Civil War, and then you get a mixture. I mean, I think in the article I compared this and I think this is quite important actually, in a number of ways. I compared the impact of what happened during the Civil War and looked at the response of that to the social questions raised, and compared it with the Beveridge report from World War II. And I think that's quite relevant, given the fact that the losses, the impact was actually probably was far greater than World War II. And yet, if you compare the two, after the English Civil War, there's no change. There's nothing to indicate things are going to get better. Yet the Beveridge report is absolutely clear during this conflict. We're not going to go back to the old system. And I think for people of that time, the only way they can interpret that, they interpret that within the role of, you know, godly events. You know, this is the way we think. And it's helped on by strange events. There's a thing called Merk Monday in 1652. It's a partial eclipse. And that sort of, actually, I think there's evidence to suggest there's an increase in Fifth Monarchy membership following this, because, oh my God, the end of the world is coming now.
So I mean, yes, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? There's the interplay with kind of religion and politics in this period, and you know, after the Civil War, the groups like the Levellers and so on, who start off as, you know, kind of a protest group about army pay or, you know, whatever, and then it develops into wider politics, and then people start to, you know, as you say, look at the kind of more religious sort of reasoning behind all of these things. It's a real explosion in terms of these different sort of sects and belief systems, and obviously the Fifth Monarchists are just one of these. So. Do we have any?
The other catch with the Fifth Monarchy, guys, is that you see there's estimates of the numbers. I mean, one estimate I've read is that by the 1650s, because of economic problems post-war, and you've got a lot of trade problems, an awful lot. You know, cloth industry's been hit badly. There's a lot of problems with this. That they've got up to 10,000 adherents, you know, spread down the south. Interestingly, going up to Norwich and other places, second city essentially. But again, it's very difficult to pin these numbers down, and there is a lot of variance.
I mean, do we know sort of, you know, in terms of who the sort of this particular kind of belief system, who did it appeal to? Was it sort of, you know, say particular south of England? Was it particular social groups? You know, was there sort of, I think we'll come on to talk about the role of women within the group, I think, but. You know, are there a particular? Is it an army thing? Is it a sort of a class thing? You know, how do we interpret who was sort of attracted to the Fifth Monarchists?
That's a really interesting one. I mean, I am not convinced that it's a class thing entirely. It's a mixture, because I don't think you can apply a rational approach to this. It's not a scientific exercise. This is based on a very emotional approach. So you've got, for instance, Harry Vane, who, from what I can see, is a reasonable supporter of this. I mean, Colonel Harrison is not a poor man, and he seems to, well, he's right in the middle of it. And then you've got the other people, you know, you've got the Welsh, you've got Vavasor Powell and other people. And if you look through the people who've been involved in this, I mean, some of who signed Charles's death, I'm gonna have to check names here, but we've got, you know, John Rogers, Christopher Feake. These people seem to, you know, they're middling background. They're not the poor. These are not the out of work cloth workers. Same for John Simpson. They've all got a reasonable pedigree. John Carew, you know, for instance, who signs the death warrant along with Harrison. And at the same time, you've then got other people, I think, lower down, who have quite an important. It goes across classes. And the important thing is, I think it also goes across gender with Anna Trapnell and Sarah White, and possibly others.
It's interesting, isn't it? There's sort of, you know, again, it's one of these movements where actually women seem to be taking an increasingly prominent role in this period. Again, there's sort of, you know, that women are stepping out of the shadows and getting involved in more directly in politics at this point.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you want to talk about the women bit, I mean, it's difficult to get information. I mean, Anna Trapnell's the one who comes over most. I mean, I find stuff about Cry of a Stone, I think, was one of her pamphlets. And Sarah White, I haven't got much on. One of the things that I haven't been able to track is their connect, because a lot of all these people are essentially staff London based. I mean, Anna Trapnell is a daughter of a ship involved in the shipping industry. shipwright, manual labour. A lot of this is London-based initially, from what I can see, around a small area in London. There's a sort of area of Cheapside that seems to be a hotbed of radicalism. You know, narrow lanes. None of the authorities can get in easily and get these chaps by the scruff of the neck and drag them out. You know, not with the pamphlets. But I mean, Anna Trapnell's interesting in a couple of ways, that she ends up going down to Cornwall, Devon area and preaching, you know, so that they're mobile. And for a woman roaming about preaching, fairly radical stuff. I mean, she gets thrown out by the authorities, driven back home. And one of the things interesting, I mean, she has, I mean, one of the catches of Fifth Monarchy is when Cromwell becomes Lord Protector, and that is, oh my goodness me, you've gone over the line here. And she has a real go at Cromwell about this. I mean, real ear bashing. And again, it's quite interesting. Cromwell actually talks to her personally. I mean, actually, I think if I'm correct, denying the instrument of government is actually a capital offence legally. Yet he'll have her in prison, so she can't be, you know, she can't be actually executed, and then letting her out again afterwards. And this comes up time and time again with these people. Cromwell's approach to these, I mean, Joseph Stalin would have had them, I don't know, they just seem to have gone missing. But this doesn't happen, you know. And it's
Cromwell's approach to them a lot of the time with any of these sorts of people, or people who seems to have political disagreements with, is invite them in for a kind of cup of tea and a friendly chat. Yeah. It's sort of, you know, spank them on the wrist and send them away and tell them not to misbehave themselves again.
Which they, of course, do.
Yeah, we absolutely, yes. I mean, so just before kind of Cromwell kind of becomes Lord Protector, the sort of the Fifth Monarchists kind of feel their moment has come really with the bare bones Parliament, don't they? They kind of think, this is it, we're here, guys. You know, this is sort of fulfilling our agenda. So sort of April 1653, Cromwell loses patience with Parliament and boots the rump out in his famous diatribe about, you know, no more religion than your horse, and gold is their god, and all the rest of it. And we get the establishment of the sort of nominated assemblies. But how does this sort of fulfill, do you think, what the Fifth Monarchists are after?
I think it's really quite interesting, because there's a number of contradictions here. Now, Cromwell is not a Fifth Monarchist.
No.
And having these, you know, he's an independent. Well, the Fifth Monarchists are sort of independents. So by setting up this rule of saints, and it's primarily, I think, it comes from Harrison. I think also, you know, putting a bit of pressure possibly on Lambert, but it's certainly Harrison who's a big prime mover in this, I think, in getting it to happen. Yet there's a contradiction here. It's almost as if Cromwell hasn't thought it through. You know, these guys, I mean, you could take the argument that it's quite a cynical move. Let them have a go, watch them fall flat on their face, and then we'll deal with it afterwards. That's certainly one idea. They although it's called the, I mean, bare bones Parliament, I think, you know, I mean, it's some sort of what's it? Barebone himself is the name. Jesus Christ had not died for the barebone or something.
Yes, praise God, barebones.
Yes,
you know. Yeah.
I mean, that sort of sums up some of the stuff. But these people, what's interesting about this, despite its, I mean, being supposed to be a controlled parliament, in other words, it modelled on the Old Testament Sanhedrin of an elected 70 with something like 100 odd, 20, 40 MPs, going to be selected, you know, through the local churches, through the independent churches. It just doesn't happen. So the actual number of radicals is probably no more than 20 out of the whole lot. It's a very low percentage. And I think that says quite a lot, because this reflects a problem again and again. I think one needs to really understand this. From a modern point of view, if you're going to control the electorate, you've got a pretty damn good chance of doing it. I mean, 17th century England, forget it.
There isn't really the machinery. No, there isn't the machinery for this sort of thing. So,
and it happens again, actually, interesting, with the major generals, where they're trying to get support for that. They're just the local gentry, you know, the what you really call the middling class, the lawyers, the gentry, still retain a huge degree of control. In terms of the legislation, I mean, they raise things about, you know, pensions and rights and war, but they never actually get anything particularly through. It just gets bogged down and lost. They actually achieve nothing. And then, you know, the finally December, they're outmaneuvered and just shut out of their own parliament, closed down. I mean, really, it's a bit of a farce. And I think it's interesting in that it also shows up something else, that the difference between real politic and the ability to manage systems of change and highly abstract millennial thought, which is not irrelevant today, actually. There's interesting parallels, I think.
I mean, we keep mentioning Harrison. Perhaps we should say a little bit about him, because I mean, he's probably the best known and most significant of all the kind of Fifth Monarchists. I mean, he starts off as the son of the kind of the local butcher in Newcastle under Lyme in Staffordshire. You know, his dad's mayor a couple of times, but he's not from a hugely significant background. You know, how does he sort of get to this sort of this sort of bit of prominence, really? As a sort of, is he one of these who's a military career really, as much as anything else, sort of pushes him forward?
Yeah, it's again, I've not been able to find anything particularly, you know, jot and tittle itemizing who he met so and so and this on this date, and then underwent, you know, like Cromwell's conversion in the 1630s. I haven't found anything on that. It may be out there, but I haven't found it. It's definitely through the military, number one. I've come across suggestions that up to half, at least, of the new model army preachers were influenced by Fifth Monarchy millenarian views. But it was a comment and it was unsubstantiated. So I do think there's a significant number again. But again, I think I think we've got to be careful about this, that people, I think they slide into this through a series of things. And again, looking at Harrison, I mean, he obviously wants to prosecute the war, but it strikes me the really big turning point for the majority of people is the Second Civil War. Again, Harrison, I think, is prepared to take Charles to the axe before that for the original crime, you know, for starting a war against his people. But again, I think the Second Civil War and Charles's machinations through the whole Isle of Wight negotiations pushes people more to be supportive of this. But again, tracking it with individuals in detail is a little bit tricky.
It's that sort of sense of betrayal in the Second Civil War, isn't it? You know, that the First Civil War was a legitimate conflict, but that was decided by God's, you know, we're back again to sort of God's providence decided that Parliament's victory. So what offends a lot of people with the Second Civil War is not only that the Royalists are sort of causing trouble again, but they're kind of going against God's judgments. You know, we settled this. God had decided we'd won, so, you know, just shut up and sort of, you know, kind of do what you're told now. And that seems to offend a lot of these people, doesn't it?
Yeah, I think that's the sort of catch, and you could almost make a comparison again. You know, tracking it exactly is not that easy, but I think the real change is certainly that Second Civil War. It's almost like you get it, I don't know, pushing, just to make a modern comparison. You know, you could almost look at XR. The only way to get change is to get out on the streets. You know, we've tried talking to you. You're not listening. So
yes, that's Extinction Rebellion, isn't it? Yeah.
I think, you know, there's a certain parallel. I wouldn't want to go too far. There's a certain parallel between, my God, we've had enough of this, you know, and we are now prepared to push it even further. You know, and that's with I think a lot of people on the periphery come in and out on that basis, you know.
And of course, it's sort of also spread by the sort of the print culture of the time as well, isn't it? So again, that centres on London, and you can see why a lot of people in London are doing that. You know, the sort of pamphleteering, the news books of the period, this sort of popular explosion in the popular press, that sort of helps a lot of these groups, doesn't it?
Yeah, I mean, again, looking at trying to get the numbers of pamphlets are printed and who reads them. Certainly London's not a problem. The issue comes when you were, I mean, again, I've not done this, but again, it becomes very difficult. If you were trying to really track the influence, you need to track people out into the provinces when they went, track that against the nominal Fifth Monarchy movement. And also the pamphlets, you know, did pamphlet X or Y arrive in Norwich or Colchester, you know, or up north somewhere? And again, that's information we just haven't got. So there's a lot of general suppositions still. It doesn't mean it's not out there. It just means it's
difficult, very difficult to track, as always with these things. Yeah. Unfortunately, there isn't a census as we've got coming up at the moment, where there's a lovely tick box that says, you know, are you a Fifth Monarchist or not? So those records don't survive.
I suppose you could always put Fifth Monarchist. I wonder what would happen if you put Fifth Monarchist in.
Well, there's something for people to try.
Okay, don't blame me, folks.
I mean, then sort of obviously, you know, they think the high watermark, their moment has come with the sort of the bare bones parliament, as we said, and then that all goes a bit pear shaped, and the majority of bare bones parliament kind of agree at the end of the year to sort of effectively hand over power to Cromwell and the new constitution. I mean, that must have sent like the sense of betrayal to many of these people at that point. It's sort of a system of government that, you know, they hadn't bargained for, kind of what eventually would become, you know, a king in all but name.
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to find it. I can't remember it offhand, but the real country, I mean, it's not, I think what's interesting, it's not the Fifth Monarchy radical members who closed the parliament down. They're totally outmaneuvered.
Yeah.
I mean, their attendance is erratic, and they're just grade A shafted. The people who are against them, it's over a religious reform issue again, which would have been radical, and the moderates just come in and close the thing down, and these guys are shut out. The big betrayal comes obviously because after that, when we get, you know, the idea of Lord Protector and the instrument of government, Cromwell come in, and this really lets rip. I'm just trying to find the I think it's one of the main, John Rogers. I mean, there are a number of specific pamphlets, without trying to find it at the moment, but there are definite pamphlets from people like Rogers who basically accuse Cromwell of being the lowest of the low. John Simpson at one point, I think, has he's got stuff out accusing Cromwell of breaking every single commandment, all the 10 commandments.
That's a clever trick, yeah. You know,
which is quite good, really.
Yeah.
But there's a lot of anger, an awful lot of personal invective, which then leads these people, you know, as I say, I mean, Feek and the others end up being, you know, or that nearly all of them spend time in prison, locked away for awkwardness. But, you know, 1653 onwards, quite a lot of those people are locked up, but again, they get released. You know, Cromwell releases a number of them. I mean, Harrison gets put away for a while, stripped of his command, you know.
Yeah.
Hang on, Harrison, you're in the army, you're following orders. You're not doing this. And interesting as well, Overton from the Leavenworth movement connection, he's bunged away with a lot of them. So there's this interaction going on, you know.
Although they sort of, you know, they sort of, you know, seem to be kind of pamphleteering and decrying the government, and, you know, they sort of, you know, as you say, locked away in kind of periods of imprisonment or house arrest or stripped of things. You know, there doesn't sort of seem to be an active persecution of them, but there doesn't also seem to be, you know, anything terribly active on their part. They're not getting involved in any of the plots against Cromwell or anything like that, are they? You know, there's sort of, you know, the likes of things like the assassination plots, the Syndicum plot, you know, that's, you know, instead disaffected levellers rather than, you know, doing deals with the royalists rather than the Fifth Monarchists getting involved with anything like that.
You're absolutely right. I mean, there's no direct evidence for that. And again, it would, one of the things I haven't done was just looking at all the names of everybody's, I mean, the lower people involved in this, and seeing if they've got any connection. But again, it's trying to find it. It's, you know, it's asking the right question, which is amongst this. I would agree with you. I don't see any evidence of them being involved as such. However, there is a particular plot. I mean, one of the things that they seem to have been working on was what was going to happen when Cromwell died. And there's a particular plot in 1657. And there's a number of things that are interesting. Again, this starts off in London, in Shoreditch. And it's Thomas Vena who keeps popping up. He's at the center of this, along with a number of the others. And the idea is to basically revolt. Now, Vena's got an interesting sort of history. Just remember some of the things. He'd had various positions. He was in charge and a quite responsible position in the Tower in the early 1650s, but then got chucked out of it for planning to blow it up. I mean, and again, he doesn't get executed. I mean, it's absolutely insane. The man he gets it locked away, gets released. They run this plot. But what's interesting, I think this says a lot about the Fifth Monarchy. It was the idea with this plot was supposed to kick off in London. It was basically centered around a Mile End area. But it was supposed to kick off, and then there were supposed to be revolts elsewhere in other areas of the country. Now, the other areas didn't take it up. So this thing went off like a bit of it, didn't even go off. But the others had nothing to do with it. And the evidence says because they saw no sign from God. Now, I don't know what the sign from God is that you should revolt. I don't know what they would be looking for.
So some form of divine missive arrive on the doormat that morning. Yeah.
What is that divine missive? So it's not Monday or something. And again, it's not delineated what that was. At least I've not found it. But certainly there seems to be no sign from God as why it's not taken up. What happens to the one in London? The other interesting thing is it never gets like the 1661 revolt with Vena's later revolt. It never takes off. Why? Because Thurlow has got his finger in the pie. And it's quite interesting. Thurlow has got his hands on these guys. He seems he's even got people infiltrating. Again, trying to get names. The evidence suggests this, but I've got no names at the moment. But it seems that he got plants watching these people. So when they plan this thing, that it never happens. They all basically the troops roll up. They all get arrested, and they get imprisoned, and then they get released again later.
Yeah.
I mean, anybody else? I mean, Charles. I mean, what was it? I mean, Charles I would have had them strung up by something extremely painful, and then ritually dissected.
I mean, this is it, isn't it? I mean, they're part of the reasons. I mean, they don't seem terribly efficient in terms of, shall we say, direct action, as it were, in modern terms. But also, as you say, that Thurlow and sort of the Cromwellian spy network seems to have them thoroughly infiltrated and know what they're up to. So, frankly, it's kind of all seems a bit futile, really, for much of the 1650s.
Yes, I think it is. One of the things that's just looking at, I mean, they don't really achieve anything at all. That they have a plan, and this comes back. They've got from what I've seen, they're supposed to have had a plan to take over when Cromwell died. Now, from what I've found, the suggestion is Harry Vane was on the periphery of this because he's got some standing, But apparently it breaks down because obviously Harry Vane, after Cromwell's death and Richard getting pushed out the way, there's a couple of things with this actually. Vena actually gets locked up again after this. Richard Cromwell releases him. I mean, this seems to run through the whole thing, I don't know what the pressure is, whether it's coming from other people like Harrison or what, but they're treated phenomenally leniently. But on this plot, it seems to fall apart because Harry Vane gets basically ousted because everybody's worried about his potential to become a dictator. Now, whether that reflects exactly what he was saying in Fifth Monarchy terms, or because the Fifth Monarchy, let's be clear, is a dictatorship. It's not a bunch of liberals. It's a bunch of people. We are godly. We know what's right. You are going to do what we say. And frankly, that'd be a grade A pain in the neck.
Mm. Yes, they're not advocating sort of you know, a wider expression of the vote like the Levellers are, or anything like that at all. They're, you know, quite the opposite in many respects. It's the sort of you know, the godly elect who are going to sort of, you know, decide. It's sort of what happens to everybody. It's
yeah, I mean, there's
not a
actual
pleasant
quotes
prospect
there from some of them. You know, if I'm translating it roughly, I'd have to find it, but it's, you know, if the people don't like it, they should be forced to do it.
Mm.
I think that's something from Feek, if I remember correctly. But yeah, you're absolutely right. These are, I think that's one of the differences. They are not at the same level of appeal. They've got the same appeal in that, and again, in their writings, I think it's Feek and people writing about, you know, there will be, or everybody will be equal. They've got this egalitarian thing that runs through it. Yet it's not egalitarian because they want then a select number of egalitarian. And I think what's interesting,
see, egalitarianism amongst the godly.
yeah, egalitarian amongst the people who we think should be equal. You know, all Republicans are equal, but some Republicans are more equal than others.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously they don't manage to sort of achieve anything much in the 1650s, not least then, you know, the chaos after Cromwell's death. You know, they're one of obviously a multitude of political factions floating around in the aftermath of that. But they have this last hurrah. Again, it's our friend Vena again pops up after the Restoration. You know, talk us through Vena's rising and sort of, you know, their kind of last hurrah, as it were.
Well, again, this kicks off in London. Yeah.
So this is 1661, isn't it?
1661. Yeah. I mean, early 1661. That again is quite interesting. I mean, Pepys has written a bit on this, and one of his comments is, you know, they were charging through something, God and Jesus. I mean, he makes the direct connection from that and has noted a few things about them. But the interesting is how many of them are there. Now, I've got numbers between, even the contemporary sources, there's numbers between 80 and 800.
It's quite a difference.
There is a big difference. And to be very specific about this, again, I mean, I've not gone through all the detail on this again, because again, it's actually getting a hold of some of this stuff is actually really quite difficult. But there's at least a good 100. So that they actually, and I mean, interesting enough, they seem to be reasonably well supplied with muskets.
So what are they actually planning to do? What's the sort of
well, this is the whole point. What they're planning to do is overthrow the Parliament, and get rid of the king and establish the rule of the saints. I mean, if you look at it in terms of a military operation, it's a complete farce. There's no idea. It's not like Lenin, you know, with the October Revolution. Not getting guys to seize key bridge points, you know, get some guys into Parliament, shut the doors, shoot the Parliament MPs they don't want. No sort of hitting targets. They end up in St. Paul's first of all. They sort of put sentries on that, and it really seems to kick off. They've got sentries there, so they've taken this almost irrelevant centre, and what I consider the first actual death is somebody walks past one of the sentries. The sentry says, "Who are you for?" And he says, "Well, I'm for the king." So he shoots him. I mean, this is, this says a lot. I mean, these guys are pretty violent. They then it ends up basically with a running fight through various parts of London. They actually, what's interesting, they stand off the militia quite well. And they cause a number of casualties. Again, the casualty numbers are difficult to ascertain. Their numbers are whittled down. They seem to be able to fight, and I think this is to do with the alleyways and the rest of it. They seem to be able to fight, run off, get cornered somewhere else. And this drags on for quite a while. But, they have to bring troopers in, dragoons in from outside. And these guys certainly put up a pretty good fight, A number of them are killed. Vena gets injured, wounded, and they're eventually captured. But I mean, in terms of actually,
I mean,
it's
presumably quite a few of them had seen military
outright
service.
irrelevancy.
Mm,
I mean, in terms of respect for any form of human life, it's a farce,
mm,
and it's quite disturbing that these people they seem to have no interest in the damage they're causing elsewhere.
mm,
And I think that says a lot.
mm,
You know, I'm not very. It stops being they're a bit of a joke up to that point. Then it
mm.
stops being a joke.
Yeah.
You know, however much one doesn't like Charles II, you know, it gets a little bit serious.
Mm. Yeah, that's a nice hurrah. So obviously, then I mean, with much of their kind of leadership, sort of such as they are by that time, rounded up. Harrison has just have already gone, and a couple of the others have already gone to the gallows as regicides as well. So the kind of presumably the movement just falls apart at that point. Sort of it's lost its relevance and its leadership.
Yeah, I mean, I think what happens is, I think a lot of real politic comes into this. And again, you could track this with odd individuals who, I think Simpson is one of them off the top of my head. They come back to a much lower level. I mean, one of the guys I mentioned is Vavasor Powell, who was involved in this. And he's an interesting case because they go to baptism.
Mm.
They go to a very much a non-violent. Powell's interesting because he's slung in prison a number of times. I mean, they don't stop preaching. The Baptist, approach, but it's a non-violent one. But I think the problem is, from the authorities' point of view, I mean, there's a couple of things that happen. I think one of the things that kills them is the 5 Mile Act, because under Charles II, they really clamped down on this. You can't have independent preachers within 5 miles central London, etc. And they do seem to be able to enforce this. And I think this is all part of we've had enough trouble, we've had enough turbulence, we just want to settle down. And it's within the context of that. And
The sort of 17th century desire for order and stability above all.
well, yes, and I think amongst probably a lot of ordinary people as well. Frankly, I mean, again, you've got nothing from ordinary people, but I think from the ordinary people with Vena's last event, and you're thinking, what the devil? You don't want to be involved with these people. But let's rather get on with, I want to get on with my shop. It's simple as that, I think.
Yeah.
I want to get back and get my business going. But I mean, Powell's interesting in that he's arrested several times because, I mean, the Baptists and the Quakers are still, they're a threat because of their equality. Although they're not preaching violence, they're still a threat, and they're non-conformists. And these people they're a bit outside the pale. And he ends up actually being arrested and dying in prison for continuing to preach. Though though it's non-violent, I can see, when you read it, you can see what the authorities take it as a potential problem. I mean, there's other strange bits. I mean, they crop up. There's an apparently event in 1671 where some cow, it's in New Palace Yard. It's in the middle of London. And a stray cow breaks into something and chaos ensues. And you get a bit of a fuss. And apparently there's people running around saying the Fifth Monarchists are rising again. There's this sort of like bogeyman thing sitting underneath all the while. There was an argument that Colonel Blood had been involved, but I can't see no evidence for this.
No, I think he's far too, from what I gather about him, he's far too self-interested for this sort of thing.
Yeah, there is a final one at Sedgemoor with the Monmouth Rebellion, where there's a connection there with the Vena family grouping. Oh, that's not the final connection. There's one final, who's actually one of the cavalry commanders. And that, I mean, the whole thing with that is, without getting lost in that, but what's interesting about the Monmouth Rebellion is the number of old parliamentarians and that middle class not sorry middle class, that those people in trade who are ex-parliamentarians who joined that rebellion, very much for religious independence and freedom, and that's almost the last big gig.
There's a lot of them sort of saying that, you know, it's all part of what they see as the good old cause,
yes,
which is, you know, cited in 1685 for the sort of the Monmouth rebellion. So yes, it's interesting, isn't it? Sort of it almost feels like the last hurrah in a way, really.
But I mean, it's definitely not. I mean, there is a difference. That's not a millenarian event.
No,
that's very much, I think, a civil rights event. You know, and the idea again, it's the idea of putting Monmouth on the throne. I mean, come on, guys.
So I suppose in one sense, and as a kind of almost concluding thought, really, I mean, it's this fascinating kind of discussion is that's the difference between the sort of Fifth Monarchists' religious idealism, or sort of, you know, in terms of what the perfect world should be, and that of Cromwell, who, yes, he's tempered by God's providence, but he's also tempered by pragmatism. Yeah. You know, Cromwell is the ultimate pragmatist. So, you know, in a way, it's a matter of, well, you know, okay, this is God's providence and what God might be telling me, but I've got to do that by what's also realistic as well. And that's probably where the Fifth Monarchists fall down, is that they're just not realistic in terms of the way they want to achieve things. They've got a lovely idea of how things should be, but no roadmap for how to actually get there.
And I really think the other thing that, I mean, the only thing that strikes me, Cromwell could I think have been a lot more brutal and got away with it. And the difference between Vena and Cromwell, I think, is important. I think that tells us a lot. You know, there's something very, very important there.
Yeah, there's sort of, as you say, those sort of things of, you know, we'll sort of shoot people on sight for effectively expressing a different political viewpoints. You know, in many respects, it's probably a good thing that the Fifth Monarchists didn't get any further, if that was the outlook that they, you know, some of them were espousing. So, yeah, there we go. John, it's been an absolutely fascinating discussion this morning, and a real window into, in one sense, quite an obscure, but as I say, no doubt on, you know, hugely fascinating and very strange group who, as you say, still has sort of, you know, some contemporary resonance even today. So thank you very much for joining me this morning.
Thank you very much.
You're very welcome. Thank you very much indeed. Yes. So all of you watching, hope you enjoyed that. Hope you found that interesting. If you want to find out more information about this period in history, please do look at our website, cromwellmuseum.org. Details you'll find in the context card at the end. You'll also find on there also details of how to donate to the museum as an independent charity, or you can purchase items, including many books, which will tell you more information about this particular period from our online shop. Please also remember to like and subscribe.
Babylon is fallen, is fallen, is fallen. Babylon is fallen to rise no more. Babylon is fallen, is fallen, is fallen. Babylon is fallen to rise no more.